I will begin with an admission no author is supposed to make. I do not know exactly how much of what you are about to read I invented. This is not false modesty. It is an occupational disease. Anyone who spends long enough looking at the world, not at the headlines, but at what has been left lying between them, eventually grows accustomed to a certain suspicion. It goes like this. The things with the greatest consequences never look like what they truly are. They wear a different face, a cheaper one we readily believe because believing it requires less effort. We have been taught to look for the monster, the dark alley, the unhinged stare, the confession. But the monster, if it exists, keeps records. It has a secretary, an accountant, a calendar marked with document retention periods. Twice a year, in spring and autumn, it hosts a meeting, and nothing on the agenda is anything one could not show to the tax authorities. I am one of those people who have spent too much time with lists, missing person statistics, for example. Most of those who disappear are found again. Some are not. And those who are not are, statistically speaking, of little interest. That lack of interest is precisely what makes them interesting. A number for which no one feels responsible is the safest place in the world, and when something cannot be concealed, it is not hidden. It is translated, turned into a version we know how to read. A scandal, an affair, a sordid little story with a villain, a victim, and a moral, served lukewarm to an audience that is outraged today and has forgotten everything by the weekend. Outrage is shallow water. Anything can be buried beneath it. There are evenings that take place half a step beyond the readable world. There are agreements, rooms, a line drawn along the edge of a forest. I tell myself I have never stood at such a line. This book says something different about its characters, that once you cross it, you return as someone else. Not necessarily as someone guilty, as someone who knows. And knowledge is its own form of membership. Treat what follows, then, as a novel. I strongly advise you to. It is more comfortable that way. And comfort, as you will see, is the mechanism behind everything. The people in these pages would be perfectly content for you to believe that they are fictional. That is precisely how they have remained where they are for so long. It begins the way such things always begin, harmlessly. A cool office before the city awakens. Lamplight. A meticulous man washing his hands before touching the files, not because the papers are dirty, but because he is. This is The Clearing, written by Alex Kavalenko and narrated by Chuck Miller. Chapter 1. The Matter. On the morning of Tuesday, October the 7th, the law office was cold enough that Konrad Reiner kept his coat on and left the curtains closed. He preferred working by lamplight before the city below came to life. During those first hours, the room belonged to him alone, and whatever he did within it belonged to no one else either. He had not turned on the heating. He rubbed his hands together once, more out of habit than against the cold, then crossed to the cabinet that no one else in the building was permitted to open, and no one wished to. It was the week in which he prepared the documents for the autumn meeting. He did this twice a year, in spring and autumn, and had done so for so many years that his hands knew the motions before he thought of them. The files were arranged according to an order that made sense only to him and was secure for precisely that reason. Each bore a designation that designated nothing, a year, a letter, an abbreviation one might mistake for the initials of a corporation. A stranger would have taken their contents for the estate of an unusually meticulous trustee. Contracts, powers of attorney, memoranda concerning matters that had long since been concluded. Konrad called them the matters on the rare occasions when he spoke of them at all. Over the years, the word had been worn so smooth that it no longer opened onto anything. He had made coffee and placed it beside the blotting paper, where it would grow cold before he touched it. Before opening the first file, he washed his hands. He did not do this out of concern for the papers, although that was how he explained it to himself. For years, he had washed them with a thoroughness entirely out of proportion to the harmless task before him. The small basin behind the door produced nothing but lukewarm water, no matter how long one waited. He lathered his hands, turned them beneath the stream, and watched them. They were the hands of a man who had never performed heavy labor. Well kept, unremarkable, with a narrow wedding band he had not removed after Vera's death. He dried them on the linen towel the receptionist replaced every Monday, and for a moment before turning away, he caught in it the faint, clean nothingness of soap. That was enough. It was a procedure, not a thought. He could not have said when he had acquired it, and had anyone asked, he would have denied that it was a habit. He opened the first file. These preparations were never concerned with the contents of the matters themselves. Their contents rested where they rested, and no one, least of all Konrad, had any interest in disturbing them. The work concerned the maintenance of form, ensuring that the chain of custody remained unbroken, that every piece of evidence lay where it could be used against the person it bound, and that no one held his own. That was the entire art of it, and it was simple once one understood that trust was a weakness that could be replaced by bookkeeping. Those who relied on loyalty lost. Those who wrote everything down and exchanged what had been written gained a peace that required no loyalty at all. Konrad had helped build that peace. It was, in a manner of speaking, his life's work, and he tended to it with the care of a man who knew that the work encompassed him as well. He kept the oldest minutes separately inside a narrow archival box that smelled of paper long deprived of air. He did not need them for his preparations, yet he reviewed them every time, an idiosyncrasy he had never abandoned because it reassured him that the order he served was older than he was and would survive him. The handwriting changed from decade to decade. Some of the earliest entries had been made in a steep, economical hand that he had never been able to connect to a face. In the margin of those early pages, beside the note marking each completed matter, the same hand had written the same word every time, small and almost casual, as though it were a signature or a prayer, the name of a bird. Years ago, Konrad had wondered whether it was a code name, a place, or some private joke among men long dead. He had trained himself to stop wondering. The word remained there, always the same, explaining nothing, and he read past it as he would a watermark. At around 7:30, he heard the first car below, the slam of a door, footsteps that did not belong to his building. He continued working. The current file concerned the forthcoming meeting, and inside it, as in every autumn, lay the list. It was the only part of the preparations that could carelessly be mistaken for harmless. A collection of names accompanied by columns whose headings were abbreviated and meaningless. One column listed the members who would be present that autumn. Another listed what, if they had to be given a name, might be called the prospective members, those being considered for the next admission, those who had already been invited or had yet to be invited, those whose suitability had been discussed during evenings at which Konrad had been present and remained silent, because silence was what was expected of him and what he was paid to provide. He went through the column of prospective members as he always did, with the half-attention of a man checking the spelling of names. There were only a few that year. The circle rarely admitted new members and did so reluctantly. It preferred to renew itself from within, allowing sons and daughters to advance into their parents' places. Sons and daughters possessed the advantage of already being known. Half their bond had been laid before they were even aware of it. Konrad found the first two names and acknowledged them inwardly like old acquaintances. He knew their families. The third name appeared in the same typeface as the others, on the same line and in the same indifferent ink. His eyes passed over it, then returned because something about it was wrong, the way a stair feels wrong when it rises a fraction higher than the rest. Holt, Mara. He read it again. He read it a third time, slowly, letter by letter, as though slowness might either eliminate a misreading or produce one. The name remained. Beside it, in the narrow column used to record a person's origin, the connection through which they had come to the circle's attention was an abbreviation Konrad himself had introduced years earlier. It referred to one of the elders, to one of those friendly, patient hands that demanded nothing and remembered everything. Konrad set down the pen he used to correct spellings. He noticed himself doing it, and noticed that he did so gently, as though trying not to make a sound in a room where he was alone. Outside, the city was fully awake now. A bus braked. Someone laughed on the pavement. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Tuesday penetrated the closed curtains, as though through a wall of cotton. He sat very straight. He could feel the blood in his hands, a warmth that didn't belong to the cold room, and he placed his palms flat on the desk on either side of the file, as though he had to prevent the paper from rising. There were several possible explanations, and he went through them one by one, because examining explanations was his way of buying time without giving the appearance of inactivity. A namesake. The name was not uncommon. Another Mara Holt, a stranger whose family happened to bear the same name as his late wife's. The name his daughter carried because, long before she'd been old enough to understand what she was rejecting, the child had chosen not to bear his. It was possible. It remained, he told himself, within the realm of possibility. But the narrow column beside it, the abbreviation, the reference to the elder, to that hand, did not describe a coincidence. It described a path. Someone had not stumbled upon the name. Someone had placed it there. Someone had known whose name it was, and had nevertheless, or precisely for that reason, entered it into the column containing the names of those from whom they would soon demand what they demanded from everyone who wished to belong. He knew the column. He had helped devise the form in which it was kept. He knew what it meant to appear in it, and he knew that between appearing there and what followed, there was no door through which one could step back out without leaving behind the evidence that would bind one for the rest of one's life. That was the point. That was the piece he had built. It was closing now, with the indifference of a well-oiled bolt, around a name he had written on birthday cards and had barely spoken aloud in recent years. It was Tuesday, October the 7th, and it was the last morning on which Konrad Reiner could still tell himself that he merely administered the matter and took no part in it. He did not allow the thought to finish. He had learned not to finish thoughts that led him to a place from which continuing his work would become impossible. It was an acquired skill, almost a physical one, stopping just before the threshold. Instead, he did what had calmed him for 30 years. He examined the facts of the form. When would they meet? Who would be present? When and in which of the houses would the prospective members be discussed? Had Mara already been discussed in his absence, something that happened rarely and never without intention. He saw that the meeting had been scheduled for the final weekend of October, as always. He saw that the column of prospective members had already been entered in its final form, which meant that the deliberations were over. They were no longer asking him. They were informing him. The difference was invisible in that handwriting, in that ink, and it was everything. Against his will, he thought of an old matter, one that years ago had escaped the boundaries of discretion and assumed, outside in the world and in the newspapers, a form that had nothing to do with what had actually happened. At the time, people had spoken of money, an estate, and a thin notebook said to contain names. They had been outraged, then bored, and after a few weeks they had forgotten the entire affair because the form they had been given was one designed to be forgotten. No one outside had ever learned what it had truly been about. When the story first broke, Konrad had endured several restless nights. Then he had understood that the world's false memory was the greatest protection the circle possessed, better than silence itself. Silence provoked curiosity. A sordid little story satisfied it. He had learned from that. He had put the thought away as one puts away a tool one knows will be needed again. His daughter bore the name Holt because Vera's name had been Holt, and because during the few months she had left, Vera had insisted that the girl continue to carry her name rather than his. He had not objected. At the time, it had seemed generous, a concession made to a dying woman. Only years later had he wondered whether Vera had seen more clearly than he had, whether she had sensed something she could never have named and perhaps had never wished to name. That it would be better if the child were not attached to the name of the man who kept the matters. Mara had been 9 when her mother died. She was now in her late 20s, and had someone asked him without warning exactly how old she was, Konrad would have needed a moment to calculate it. That single second of calculation shamed him more than many other things. They rarely spoke. There had been no rupture he could point to, no words spoken that could never be taken back. There had only been the slow mutual practice of distance, the birthday cards he sent punctually and without any additional message, the brief telephone calls on holidays during which each took care not to say anything that would oblige the other to ask a question. He had considered it a kind of peace. Now, with the file beneath his hand, he understood that the distance he had cultivated had not protected her. It had left her without protection. He had never known whom she associated with, whose kindness had flattered her, or through which door they had approached her. He picked up the coffee, which had gone cold, and took a sip because his throat was dry, and because drinking was an action that allowed him, for a moment, to do nothing else. Over the rim of the cup, he studied the page. The name lay there, small, factual, arranged among the others. It did not look like the end of anything. It looked like every other name. And that was the worst of it, that it did not stand out. That the form had absorbed it as water absorbs a stone, with a ripple already smoothed away before anyone thought to look. He could have stood up. He could have called the elder immediately, that very morning, and said that a mistake had been made. He would then have listened as the man kindly explained that there was no mistake, in a tone that transformed the question itself into a confession. Konrad knew how the conversation would proceed, because he had conducted such conversations from the other side many times, with the patience of the man who held the evidence. He set down the cup. There was no point in removing a name from a column. He had learned that over 30 years and had occasionally been required to teach it to others. A column was not a piece of paper. It was an agreement, and the agreement had already been made during evenings in rooms where names were spoken aloud, where men looked at one another and wrote nothing down because what remained unwritten was the most binding thing of all. The name could be crossed out. What it represented could not. Nor would it help to warn the girl, because to warn her, he would have to tell her what he was warning her against. To explain that, he would have to tell her how he knew. The moment he did so, he would cease to be the custodian and become a matter administered by someone else. He knew the file they kept on him. He had not created it, but he knew where it was stored. And he knew what it contained because a long time ago, in a place he did not allow himself to think about, he had made certain with his own hands that it contained something. That had been the price of admission, the same for everyone. No one kept his own evidence, and no one ever regained possession of it before he had paid the price. Nor afterward. A door slammed below, closer this time, inside the stairwell. The receptionist had arrived. He heard the rustle of her coat, the turn of her key, the familiar prelude to a working day that was now beginning and would contain appointments, clients, and matters of another, more harmless kind. In a few minutes, she would knock and ask whether he needed anything. He would say no, as he did every morning, and she would close the door again. Konrad looked at the page one final time. Then he closed the file, returned it to its place within the order that made sense only to him, and locked the cabinet. Without looking, he pressed his palm against the door to confirm that it was secure. He carried the cold cup to the window, drew the curtain aside by an inch, and allowed the gray light to enter. It illuminated nothing he had not already seen. A bird sat on the ledge outside, a blackbird or something similar. He knew nothing about birds. It watched him for a moment and was gone. When the receptionist knocked, he was already seated at his desk again, facing a different matter, an ordinary one, an inheritance case he intended to conclude that morning. He had put the page away as though he had never seen it. Chapter 2. What She Wanted. At just after 1 a.m. on Thursday of that same week, Mara Holt sat in front of 2 monitors, cutting the acceptance speech of a man she had never met into a version in which he sounded more intelligent than he had been. It was contract work for a production company making a promotional film about a property developer. The man had spoken for too long, breathed in all the wrong places, and twice pronounced the word sustainability as though he needed to rinse his mouth afterward. Mara's job was to make all of that disappear. She was good at it, so good that, by the end, no one would ever know there had been anything to remove. That was precisely the problem with her profession. The better she did her work, the less of her remained visible. The apartment consisted of 1.5 rooms beneath the eaves. In October, the radiator cracked and knocked whenever it came on, a metallic tapping that returned every few minutes and against which Mara had been waging a futile private war for 2 years. On the table beside the keyboard stood a plate containing the remains of something that was supposed to have been rice. Beside it lay an invoice she had issued 3 weeks earlier, and to which no one had responded, face down. She had turned it over because she knew the amount and did not want to read it every time she reached for the mouse. She exported the final version, leaned back, and removed her headphones. In the silence, she heard the radiator, a bus somewhere below, the hum of the monitors. She was 29 and worked at night because the rates were the same as during the day, and because she needed the days to write the emails with which she applied for the next job she would then complete at night. It wasn't a life anyone would have chosen. It was a life one had slipped into, one decision at a time, each of them perfectly reasonable on its own. She could have gone to bed. Instead, she did what she always did when a project was finished. She watched the result one more time, not to change anything, but to check whether she was there, whether her hand could be recognized in it. It could not. The property developer now spoke smoothly and warmly into the camera, a man one could easily believe built sustainably. In the credits the company would later add, her name would appear in a font size visible only to those who already knew it was there. The last time they had misspelled it, Holt's instead of Holt. When she pointed it out, they apologized but did not correct it because the film had already been delivered. She had laughed about it, alone in this apartment. Holt's. Wood. It was almost better. It suited something that could be stacked and burned. Once, 18 months ago, it had been different. For almost no money, she had taken on the editing of a small documentary about a clinic where they treated people no one else wanted to treat anymore. The material had gotten beneath her skin in a way she had trained herself to avoid in this business. She had spent unpaid nights working on it, placing images beside one another until together they said something that none of them had contained alone. The film had screened at 2 festivals in half-empty theaters and then vanished, as films like that vanished. Afterward, one person had written to her, a stranger, a single line saying that one particular scene would not leave him alone. She had kept the message. If she was honest, it was the most valuable thing she had earned in 5 years. She liked to follow thoughts like that to their conclusion because doing so cost her nothing and sometimes hurt. At least the pain belonged to her. Then she sent the file, entered the invoice number into a spreadsheet containing too many open rows, and went to bed. The message arrived the following morning while she was in the shower, and her phone vibrated twice against the edge of the bathtub. She did not see it until she was drying her hair. There was a voice message from Leonie, and beneath it a second line she had typed, "Call me when you're awake. I have something for you. Something real." Leonie had been the production manager on a project in the spring. She was one of the few women in the business whom Mara did not have to consider an ally in order to get along with her. She also had enough connections that when she said something real, it did not automatically mean less than when other people said the big break. Mara did not call immediately. She made coffee, looked out over the courtyard, where a neighbor had been meaning to dispose of a cabinet since summer and never did, and allowed the words to sit for a while. Something real. Almost nothing in her profession was real. Everything was a favor that would later have to be repaid, or a possibility that dissolved the moment one reached for it. She had learned to treat promises like the invoices on her table, face down. She called anyway. Leonie sounded excited. She spoke quickly in the tone of someone giving a gift and warming herself on her own generosity. It was about a position, she said, though position was the wrong word. It was more like she searched for it, an invitation, a program. Someone was building something, a home for stories, for voices no one had heard before. Properly funded, serious, not some internship scam. There was money. There were names. There were doors. And someone, Leonie said, had seen Mara's work. What work? Mara asked. The property developer. The documentary. The one about the clinic last year. Someone asked, "Who edited this?" Do you understand what that means? Someone asked who. Mara understood what it meant. It probably meant nothing. At the same time, it meant the one thing she had been starving for all these years without admitting it to herself. That somewhere, in a room she had never entered, someone had seen her editing and asked who had done it. Her hand had been visible. She had counted briefly for the duration of a question. "And who was it?" she asked. People, Leonie said, and the word contained the whole world Mara did not know. People who make things happen. I'm not allowed to give you names yet. That's how they are. It's their style. Very discreet, very, you know. But this is big, Mara. This isn't one of those things where somebody's nephew gets the job in the end. It's always one of those things where somebody's nephew gets the job in the end. Leonie laughed. It was the laugh of someone who knew Mara was right and knew that this time would be different anyway. It was that laugh, more than anything, that allowed Mara to believe her for a moment. Not this time, Leonie said. This time they're asking for you. Mara said nothing. Into the silence, Leonie continued more quietly now, more intimately. It's one weekend, at the end of the month. A house in the country, very secluded, very beautiful. I've been near there once. You go, you meet some people, you talk about your work, and if it isn't for you, you leave. No one is forcing you to do anything. A weekend in the country with people whose names you're not allowed to tell me, Mara said. That sounds either like the beginning of a career or the bad ending of a television series. Leonie laughed again, but this time the laugh came a fraction too quickly. For the briefest moment, Mara heard something else beneath it, something strained, as though Leonie were checking an obligation off a list. Then it was gone, and Leonie was Leonie again. You're impossible, she said warmly. That's exactly why they want you. They spoke for a while longer. Leonie had no answers to the questions that mattered. Who were they? How much would Mara be paid? What would she be working on? What would they expect in return? But her lack of answers did not sound evasive. It sounded initiated, as though the questions Mara was asking were the questions of someone still standing outside, someone who did not yet understand the rules within. There would be a meeting, Leonie said. A first conversation, entirely informal, sometime in the next few days, somewhere pleasant. They would get to know one another. Mara should simply come and take a look. What did she have to lose? It was the one question Mara could not answer honestly, because the honest answer was nothing. And that nothing she had to lose was the true point of pain. After the call ended, she remained by the window, the cold coffee in her hand. She recognized the mechanism now stirring inside her. She was not naive. She had seen enough people follow voices like Leonie's and return smaller than they had been when they left. She knew that something real in this business almost always meant someone wanted something from you, that they were not willing to name in advance. She could have explained all of this to someone less intelligent than she was. It made no difference. Beneath her skepticism, more persistent than the skepticism itself, lay a desire older than her profession, older than this apartment. It was so old that she could not remember ever having been without it. That someone would look at her and stay, that her name would be spelled correctly, that if she were gone one day, a chair would remain empty and someone would notice that it was empty. She set down the cup and looked around the apartment as though seeing it for the first time through the eyes of people who made things happen. The 1.5 rooms, the knocking radiator, last night's plate, the spreadsheet with its open rows. It wasn't misery. She knew what misery looked like. This was merely narrowness. A life arranged carefully enough that one never collided with its walls. For the first time in a long while, she did not wonder how she might make herself more comfortable inside it. She wondered how she might get out. She sat down at the desk, moved the property developer aside, and typed Leonie's name into a search engine, adding words beside it. program, foundation, fellowship, voices. As expected, she found nothing she could hold on to, only a few hints, an event without photographs, a circle of people who apparently knew how to leave no trace. Others might have taken it as a warning. Mara took it as evidence that they were serious. People with nothing to prove did not need to advertise themselves. She turned over the invoice on the table and read the amount, voluntarily for the first time in 3 weeks. It was not much. It was precisely enough that its absence made the difference between a month one could endure and a month in which one had to ask someone for help. She calculated as she always calculated, in weeks rather than plans. What Leonie had described could not be measured in weeks. It was something that would not make the invoice on the table smaller, but would make it meaningless. A world in which one no longer turned such amounts face down, because one no longer noticed them. She opened the wardrobe containing the clothes she reserved for the rare occasions when someone was supposed to take her seriously. She took out her one dark dress, held it against herself, studied it, and hung it back up when she realized she was preparing for a meeting that had not even been arranged yet. She laughed at herself, the same laugh she had given Holt's in the credits, except this time it did not hurt. Throughout the afternoon, she worked on an application she had already half-written for something small and secure. A permanent position at a broadcaster, regular hours, a salary that arrived every month. She had nearly sent it the previous week and had found a new reason not to every day since. Now she read it again, and it seemed like a letter written by a stranger, a sensible woman, a woman who knew what was good for her. She saved it and closed the window without sending it. Toward evening, when the courtyard below had fallen into shadow and the neighbor had once again failed to appear for the cabinet, she wrote back to Leonie. At first, she typed a cautious sentence, something involving "sounds interesting and I'll think about it." She read it and deleted it because it sounded like someone pretending to have options. She had no options, and the performance required energy she needed elsewhere. Instead, she wrote what was true, exactly as much of the truth as she could allow. "I'm in. Tell me where and when. I'll be there." She studied the message before sending it. 3 sentences, matter of fact, no exclamation marks. The final one almost a promise to herself. "I'll be there." Then she sent it. The moment the small check mark appeared, showing that the words had left her, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, and would have been ashamed of had anyone been there to witness it. It was not anticipation. She was too sober-minded for that. It was the naked, fragile happiness of someone who had been addressed and had answered. She wanted to tell someone. That was the reflex that followed the fragile happiness, to pass it on so that it might grow larger. She went through the short list in her mind and realized just how short it was. Leonie already knew. A handful of colleagues would have congratulated her politely while privately calculating what it might mean for them. And then, as always at the end of lists like this, there was her father. She thought of him less often than a guilty conscience might have demanded. When she did, she thought of him as an address to which one wrote at Christmas. She imagined calling him and saying, "Listen, something is happening. Someone asked about my work." She imagined the courteous pause during which he would consider which of his many careful answers committed him to the least. She imagined him asking who exactly, and the tone in which he would say who exactly, as though reviewing a contract. Then she would close like a pocket knife, because that was what she always did whenever he became the lawyer instead of the father. She did not call him. There was no reason. There was never a reason. That was the result of 20 years during which both of them had avoided every individual reason that presented itself. She placed the phone face down beside the overturned invoice. It looked as though it belonged there. She ate the remaining rice cold, standing at the window. It tasted better than it had the night before. Chapter 3. The Memory. On Friday of that same week, October 10th, Konrad had himself driven not to the law office but to the club he had belonged to for 30 years and in which he had never felt at ease. He had a pretext, though it was not truly a pretext. Before every autumn meeting there were formal matters of custody to settle, confirmations only one man could provide, and for years it had been customary to settle them here, between 6 and 8 in the evening, beneath subdued lighting, in one of the alcoves where the armchairs were positioned so that no fourth person could join them without being invited. The club smelled of floor polish and stale smoke, although no one had smoked there in years. The smell had settled into the wood like a conviction. Konrad surrendered his coat, nodded to the attendant whose name he knew and never used, and walked to the rear alcove, where he knew he would not remain alone for long. He had brought the file containing the formalities. It was orderly and complete, genuine business behind which he intended to conceal another kind. He had resolved to be casual. He would ask a question that sounded like nothing, and determine from the answer, or from whatever the answer avoided, whether the list contained an error or a decision. He ordered a glass of wine he had no intention of drinking, and waited. He had arranged the evening in his mind like a legal brief. He would deal with the business first, thoroughly, leaving no doubt that he had come to work. Only afterward, while casually gathering the papers, would he ask the one question. He would phrase it in such a way that an innocent answer remained possible, a door through which both men might pass without anything having been said. He had conducted such conversations hundreds of times, from both sides. He knew that the art lay not in learning something, but in reading the manner in which the person opposite chose not to tell it. He straightened the papers, checked the position of his tie in the dark window, and reminded himself not to touch the wine. Lindo arrived shortly after 6:30, as always without haste, with the measured slowness of a man who had learned that the world waited for him rather than the other way around. He was over 80 and looked like someone who treated aging as a form of courtesy, slender, immaculate, dressed in a suit from a time when men still bought suits to last a lifetime. He was the one who had brought Konrad into the circle long ago, in a place Konrad did not think about. He was the one who guarded the archive containing what bound Konrad. And he was, as Konrad had never forgotten, the kindest man he had ever met. The kindness was not a mask. That was the worst thing about it. It was genuine. It demanded nothing. It left one with no place from which to defend oneself against it. "Konrad," Lindo said as he sat down, speaking the name as though it were a gift he had kept safe for him all these years. "How fortunate that the formalities are still entrusted to someone who takes them seriously. These days they do everything with machines. I trust no machine that never grows tired." "Machines forget less than we do," Konrad said. "That is precisely the problem." Lindau smiled. "They forget nothing at all. That is not a virtue. It is an illness. A person who forgot nothing would be unbearable. A person who forgets what must be forgotten and preserves what must be preserved. That is an art." He looked at Konrad gently and attentively. "You have always been very good at it." Konrad placed the file on the low table between them and opened it because the business gave him something firm to hold on to. They went through it point by point. The confirmations, the powers of attorney, the retention periods. It took 15 minutes. Lindau asked for clarification twice, and once corrected a number Konrad had remembered incorrectly, casually and without triumph. Konrad registered the mistake. He also registered that Lindau had noticed it and chosen to make nothing of it. Together, the error and the gentleness with which it was passed over formed a kind of message that Konrad could not have put into words. When the file had been closed, the moment toward which Konrad had been working arrived. He nearly allowed it to pass. Then, as he arranged the papers without looking up, he said, "I noticed something in the list. An entry that appears to be, I assume, a mistake. A connection that does not seem quite right. I wanted to clarify it before passing the list on." Lindau took a sip of wine. He set down the glass and turned it slightly so that the light passed through the wine, studying it as though something could be seen there. "You know," he said, his voice growing warmer, almost confidential, "I'm becoming old, and old men become talkative. So forgive me if I do not answer immediately. An entry. You were speaking about the form. Lately, I have often found myself thinking about those who maintain the form before us. About the beginning." He leaned back. "They were men of reason, you must understand. People forget that. They imagine figures in hoods, ghosts gathered in darkness, but they were professors and lawyers, men with clean fingernails who sat together in a small town during the 19th century and believed that the world could be made more reasonable if only the right people came to an understanding and everything else was prevented from interfering. They considered themselves enlightened. They believed what they were doing was an act of benevolence. Everything we administer, you and I, grew from that belief. That was where it began. Not in a swamp, but in a lecture hall." He spoke without gravity, almost cheerfully, an old man remembering his student days. Konrad listened and waited for the word that did not come. Mistake. Lindau had not taken up the word. He had simply allowed it to remain where Konrad had placed it, like something one politely pretended not to notice. "That is certainly interesting," Konrad said. "But the entry." "The entry," Lindau said, and for the first time he looked fully at Konrad. There was nothing threatening in his gaze, only an immense and patient attentiveness. "Is not an entry. Entries are what one writes down after a decision has been made. You are mistaking the writing for the thing itself. You never used to make that mistake." Konrad felt the blood rise into his hands and placed them calmly on the file. "I understand," he said. During the seconds of silence that followed, Konrad reviewed what remained available to him, just as he reviewed the matters every morning, not out of hope, but out of habit. He could remove the entry. They would enter it again. He could approach one of the elders. There was no elder above the man sitting opposite him. He could warn Mara. To warn her, he would have to speak. And speaking was the one course guaranteed to end in ruin. Every possibility he examined had already been examined by people who had made examination their profession. There was something almost humiliating in the reflection of it. He was assessing what had already been assessed to its conclusion. He had built the system against men like himself. "You do understand," Lindau said kindly. "You always understood more quickly than most. That is why I wanted you back then. Perhaps you no longer remember what it was like. You were young. You had just, well..." He paused. "You were in a position in which a man is grateful for any hand that holds him. I held out my hand to you, and you understood, faster than others, that the hand holding a man is also the hand that never releases him. You did not complain. You made it your profession. That was what I valued about you. You never pretended you had arrived here by accident. It was not a threat. Konrad searched the words for one, for a sentence he could quote, something he could oppose, and found none. He found only memory, warm and precise, showing him his own life like an album another person had maintained for him, more completely than he had maintained it himself. Lindau remembered Konrad better than Konrad remembered himself. That was the message. Not, I will harm you. But I have all of you from the first day onward, and I have kept you well. Lindau studied the wine for a while before continuing. When he spoke again, his voice had become even quieter, the voice of a man sharing something deeply private. I was fond of Vera, he said. I do not believe I ever told you that. She was cleverer than all of us in a way that made us uncomfortable. She once asked whether I believed in what we were doing, not whether I did it, whether I believed in it. I did not give her an answer that satisfied her. He smiled. The expression might have contained faith or mockery, and in 30 years, Konrad had never been able to decide which. Do you remember the old minutes? The earliest ones, written in that steep hand. The same little word appears in every margin, always the same, beside every completed matter. A bird. When I was young, I asked my predecessor what it meant. He told me that one day I would hear it. Nothing more. Lindau lifted the glass, did not drink, and set it down again. I never discovered the answer, and now I never will. Some things are better preserved unexplained. Explanation, you see, is an illness of reason. Our founders nearly destroyed themselves with it. They wanted to know everything. We have grown wiser. We record the word and no longer ask. One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh. Lindau said softly, almost to himself, but the earth abideth forever. He nodded faintly. A beautiful sentence. We did not invent it, but it describes us well. Individuals pass away. What we guard does not, because it renews itself. That is not an accident, Konrad. It is the principle. An order composed only of those already inside it would be an order in the process of dying. It lives because the young follow, because the children come. He paused. Nothing happened during that pause. There was only the smell of the wood and the light passing through the wine. It is the most natural thing in the world for a father to want to see his child become part of what he has built. You have built so much. There it was. He had said it without emphasis, embedded within everything else, almost in passing. That was precisely why it could not be rejected. To reject it, Konrad would have had to say aloud what Lindau had not said. The moment he did so, he would confirm that he understood they were speaking about his child. He would thereby admit the one thing he could not afford to admit, that he did not want it, that he resisted it, that he, the custodian, objected to an entry. He said nothing. He had learned that silence was the only answer that could not be used against a person. At the same time, he understood that even his silence had already been recorded, not in writing and not in any archive, but within the patient attention sitting opposite him and drinking wine. You are troubled, Lindau said, and it sounded like concern. I understand. At our age, and you are no longer a young man either, it is a great deal to reconsider all of this. But you think too much. That was already the case 2 weeks ago, when you spent longer than necessary reviewing the old archive. And the day before yesterday, that telephone call about the position in the north. A good idea, incidentally. An honorable attempt to open a door for someone. The trouble is that most doors one opens have already closed somewhere else. You know that better than I do. You built most of those doors yourself. Konrad held his gaze. He had left no record of the telephone call from the day before yesterday. He had made it from a device not registered in his name, speaking to a man he trusted as far as he trusted anyone. And Lindau knew. He mentioned it casually in passing, woven into an observation about Konrad's age. This was not information Lindau was giving him. It was information he was showing him, the way one shows a child a coin before making it disappear. So the child understands that the hand is faster than the eye. I didn't want anything, Konrad said. It was the stupidest thing he could have said, and he heard it himself the moment the words were out. Of course not, Lindau said gently, forgiving the sentence by passing over it. No one wants anything. That is the beauty of a well-ordered system. One doesn't have to want. Things happen, and one has one's place within them, and that place supports you even when you are tired. You are tired, Konrad. I can see it. Allow yourself some rest before the meeting. It will be a good meeting. He didn't finish the wine. He left the glass half full, like someone who knew he could return whenever he pleased. Then he placed his hands on the arms of the chair and rose with the same measured slowness with which he had arrived. Konrad rose as well, because one stood when Lindau stood. Give Mara my regards, Lindau said. He spoke her name lightly and warmly, with the ease of a man asking after the child of an old friend. He had not needed to use the name throughout the entire conversation. Now, as he left, standing at the edge of the alcove, he laid it down like the final page of a file that had long been complete. She is well, I hope, he asked. She must be. Such a talented young woman. Before Konrad could find an answer that revealed neither too much nor too little, Lindau had turned away. Slender and upright, he crossed the subdued room toward the cloakroom, where his coat was already waiting for him. Konrad remained standing. On the table lay the closed file containing the completed formalities. Beside it stood the half-full glass, which no one would remove while Konrad was still there. He didn't sit down again. He had received the answer for which he had come. It was not a mistake. It was a decision, and it was an old one. Perhaps older than the entry itself. Perhaps as old as the hand that had held him 30 years ago and had never released him. After a while, he took the file, left the half-full glass behind, and departed. At the cloakroom, they handed him his coat. Lindau was already gone. Outside, the air had grown colder, and the city was going about its Friday evening business. Lights, voices, the ordinary life Konrad had observed from a narrow distance for 30 years. He stood on the steps for a moment and breathed in the cold air. He noticed that he was rubbing his hands again, just as he had on Tuesday morning, although he was not cold. He stopped. Then he walked to his car. Throughout the entire journey, he thought neither of Lindau nor of the list, but of a bird whose name he did not know, which had sat on a windowsill on a gray morning, watched him for a moment and flown away. Chapter 4. The Open Door. The reception took place on a Wednesday in the second half of October, in a building Mara would have mistaken for a museum from the outside had there not been a woman at the door who knew her name before she gave it. Miss Holt, the woman said. How lovely. She said it as though Mara's arrival were a relief the entire evening had been waiting for. Her name was Sander. She was in her early 40s and wore a narrow gray suit made from a fabric that looked expensive, although Mara could not have said what gave it away. Later, she would think that this was the principle behind the entire evening. Nothing announced its price, and everything had one. Inside, it was warm and softly lit. The rooms flowed into one another beneath high ceilings. The dark parquet did not creak underfoot. Paintings hung on the walls that were clearly genuine without drawing attention to the fact. The air smelled of wax, lilies, and the perfumes of people who used perfume sparingly. At first, the dark dress Mara had taken from her wardrobe and deemed suitable felt like a costume. Then, when no one looked at her as though she were wearing one, it began to feel like something that might be enough after all. A long table held things to eat that looked as though they were meant to be observed rather than consumed. Small, pale, meticulously arranged things. A man in a white jacket refilled glasses before they were half empty, with an attentiveness so complete and so invisible that one felt cared for without ever having been served. No one spoke loudly. It was as though everyone here had learned long ago that volume was for people who needed to be heard, and that those who were heard regardless could afford to speak quietly. Without realizing it, Mara lowered her own voice. It happened within 10 minutes, without her deciding to do it. She noticed and found it less unsettling than she should have. Mrs. Sander guided her farther inside, one hand resting lightly at Mara's elbow, and began introducing her. The introductions were the first thing that unsettled Mara in a pleasant way. The people she met had heard of her. Not all of them, and never in a manner that felt forced, but 2 or 3 said, "Oh, so you're the one." Or, "I was told about the clinic film." One of them, a gaunt man wearing spectacles whose frames might have cost more than Mara's monthly rent, said, "The scene with the empty corridor, that was yours." It was a scene in which she had shown nothing but an empty hospital corridor for 2 full minutes, against every rule. No one except Mara had ever understood why it needed to remain. Now a stranger stood before her and named it as though he had looked inside her mind. Mara felt herself grow warm. She despised herself slightly for how easily she could be bought, and allowed herself to be bought anyway, because it had been so long. They listened to her. That was what she would remember most often afterward. Not the paintings and not the wine, but the way these people listened. In her world, people listened while waiting for an opportunity to speak themselves. Here, they looked at her while she spoke, and when she finished, they asked questions that proved they hadn't been waiting. A woman whose name Mara failed to retain asked about the empty corridor, about those 2 minutes of nothing, and whether Mara had been afraid they would remove them. "Yes, of course," Mara said. "They wanted to cut them. I refused." The woman smiled. "You see," she said, "exactly that." Mara did not know what exactly that meant, but she carried the words with her for the rest of the evening like a coin in her pocket. Once, she caught sight of herself in a tall mirror among all the others and, for a moment, failed to see the difference she had been afraid of seeing. There was only a woman in a dark dress, holding a glass and belonging there. Someone placed a glass in her hand, containing something pale and dry. It tasted of more than Mara understood about wine. She resolved to have only one. She made many resolutions that evening, and the peculiar thing was that they did not arise from distrust, but from its opposite, the desire not to lose access to these rooms through some act of clumsiness. The gaunt man's name was Valen. From what Mara gathered, he belonged to the worlds of media and money in some combination no one defined, and everyone seemed to understand. He possessed the kind of attention that made a person feel like the only one in the room for the duration of a conversation, then dropped them afterward like a page already read. While he was speaking to her, however, it was pleasant. He asked about her work, not with the polite curiosity of a reception, but precisely, almost technically. He wanted to know how she edited, whether she cut according to breath or meaning. "Breath," she said. "Always breath. The meaning follows by itself if the breathing is right." Valen smiled as though she had passed an examination she had not known she was taking. "That is rare," he said. "Most people edit according to what they want to say. You edit according to what is. That cannot be taught." "It can be poorly paid," Mara said. Valen laughed, briefly and genuinely, then glanced around as though searching for someone to whom he might pass the remark, someone capable of appreciating it. "Not here," he said more quietly. "Here we pay for the other thing. The thing that cannot be taught." She could have asked what here meant. She did not, because she was afraid the question might reveal her as someone who did not belong. That evening, the desire to belong was stronger than her curiosity. She noticed herself making the exchange and did not reverse it. Valen guided her through several of the rooms, his hand not touching her elbow but remaining near it, as though escorting her without contact. He casually pointed out this and that, a painting, a view, a writer whose name she recognized, and who was apparently nothing remarkable here. It flattered her to move through the rooms at his side. She noticed others watching her, assessing and reclassifying her, and caught herself straightening her back. At the end of a sequence of rooms stood a closed door, an old and beautiful double door. 2 men stood before it. They did not speak and held no glasses. Mara instinctively took a step toward it because voices could be heard on the other side. Valen placed a hand very lightly against her back and redirected her without pressure. "Not in there yet," he said with a smile. "That is for later, for those who stay. One need not see everything on the first evening." He spoke so cheerfully and so naturally that Mara registered only in passing that this was the only time all evening she had been denied entry anywhere, and that of everything she had encountered, being denied entry was the strongest lure. The rooms never filled up. They had contained exactly as many people as they were intended to contain from the beginning, perhaps 25 or 30, all of whom looked as though they had something more important to do elsewhere, and were nevertheless precisely here, because this was the most important place. Near the fireplace stood a woman dressed in dark clothing, older than Valen, speaking to 2 younger men who listened like students. She had a calm, serious face and never laughed. Once, when Mara happened to glance in her direction, the woman looked back. It was brief and assessing, without hostility, the way one might study something one was considering purchasing. Mara turned away and did not know why her heart beat faster for a moment. Later, as Mara took one of the small pale things from the table, the woman was suddenly standing nearby. Although Mara had not seen her approach, she was speaking to someone about something Mara did not entirely understand. It concerned a season, something one observed or failed to observe. With a quiet certainty that expected no disagreement, the woman said, "It is not a custom. Customs can be abandoned. This cannot." Then she moved on. Mara, who did not know what they had been discussing, retained the sentence without knowing why. The evening had grown late without time announcing itself. Mara had drunk 2 glasses instead of 1, and had spoken well with more people than she ordinarily met in 6 months. She had reached the point at which someone who has stood at the edge for a long time begins to believe that the edge itself was a mistake, a temporary condition, something now coming to an end. She stood at a window overlooking a courtyard with a fountain that was not running and studied her reflection in the dark glass. This time it didn't resemble someone who could be stacked and burned. Then someone stepped beside her. He was an old man, slender and very upright, wearing a suit that appeared to come from a time when men bought suits to last a lifetime. He held a glass from which he did not drink. He looked out into the courtyard with her as though they already shared something before exchanging a word. "The fountain will not run again until spring," he said. "They turn it off in autumn. Otherwise, the water would burst the pipes when it freezes. Water expands as it freezes, you know. The gentlest thing in the world, water. And yet it breaks iron when confined." He smiled at her kindly, without gravity. "Forgive me. I am old and say things no one wishes to hear. You are the young woman everyone is talking about." "It is news to me that everyone is talking about me." "Oh, but they are," he said, as though it were a delightful fact he took pleasure in confirming. "It is a small world, you must understand, and in a small world talent becomes known quickly." He paused. "You have no one waiting for you? No one sitting in a car downstairs, wondering how much longer it will be?" "No," Mara said. "I came alone." "And no one would worry," he said, "if it became late." It was phrased as a courtesy, the casual concern of an old man making certain a young woman would get home safely. Mara answered in that same spirit, lightly. "No, no one." Only after she had said it did she hear how it sounded. For one moment, a single moment, it seemed to her that the question he had asked was not the true question, that another lay beneath it, and that she had answered the one underneath. Then the old man smiled again. The smile was so entirely free of ulterior purpose that Mara felt ashamed of her suspicion. She had drunk 2 glasses. She was exhausted from the effort of belonging. People imagine things. "You should see Eichholm before winter comes," he said. "The estate. It is most beautiful now when the forest changes color. A few of us go out for the weekend. It is entirely informal. You speak to people. You see whether it suits you. Mrs. Sander will explain everything." He looked at her, and in his gaze was a kind of benevolence Mara had never encountered anywhere else in her life, and for which, she realized with a mixture of happiness and shame, she had been starving. "Come," he said. "I would be pleased to see you there again." Then he inclined his head, a small old-fashioned bow more than a nod, and walked away. Mara watched him go and realized she had never learned his name. She had not dared to ask because not asking was part of the language of the evening. Mrs. Sander found her again shortly afterward, with the light and certain approach of someone who had known where Mara was throughout the entire evening. "You spoke with him," she said, and there was something in her voice that Mara interpreted as approval. "Did he mention Eichholm?" "Yes." "Good," Mrs. Sander said. "Very good. Then it is almost settled." She laughed, a bright, reassuring laugh. "I mean, if you want to go, of course. No one is forcing you to do anything. It is only a weekend." They discussed the practical details. They would leave on Friday and return on Sunday. Everything would be prepared. A car would collect Mara outside her building at midday on Friday, and she needed only to wait downstairs. She didn't need to bring anything except herself and perhaps something warm. The forest was cool at that time of year. Like everything else that evening, it sounded as though every detail had already been considered. as though Mara needed to do nothing except allow herself to be carried. As Mrs. Sanders spoke in that warm, effortless tone, Mara looked past her into the rooms that were slowly emptying, at the candlelight and the genuine paintings, and thought that this was the life she had not known she was missing until someone held open its door. She never explicitly agreed. There was no moment in which someone asked and she answered. The acceptance formed by itself, through her nodding, through the writing down of an address, through Mrs. Sanders saying, "Then we will see you on Friday," and Mara failing to contradict her. This was how things worked here, she understood. One was not asked and did not say yes. One simply stopped saying no, and at some point, one was inside. At that moment, she did not find the thought threatening. She found it comfortable. It was a relief not to have to choose, the kind of relief she had not known in a long time. Only once she was outside in the cold air, with the taste of wine still in her mouth, did the old man's question return without invitation and remain inside her for a moment. No one would worry if it became late. She pushed it away. It had been a kind question from a kind old man on an evening when, for the first time in years, everything had been kind. She pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the train. She had already agreed without ever saying the word. Chapter 5. Maneuvers. Konrad did not brood. Brooding was a way of keeping oneself occupied without doing anything, and he had never had any use for such occupations. The day after the meeting at the club, he treated the situation as he treated every situation, as a matter that could be brought under control once the correct sequence had been found. The correct sequence, as he had learned over 30 years, never began with what one wanted. It began with what one had. He had connections. For years, he had extended favors like a man who understood that a harvest was not gathered on the day the seeds were sown. It was time to collect one. The cleanest idea was also the simplest. There was no need to warn Mara, enlighten her, or take her by the hand. She merely needed a reason to be somewhere else that weekend. A better reason. One that appeared to come from her own world, that would seem like good fortune rather than rescue. Konrad had arranged such diversions many times before, for the circle and for members who could not afford to be seen in certain places. He knew the craft of gently guiding someone out of a room without their ever realizing they had been guided. Now, for the first time, he would use the same methods against the circle. The irony did not escape him, but he had learned to disregard irony whenever it interfered with the work. He called Dietmar from a telephone that was not registered in his name. Dietmar was a man from the world of productions and foundations, whom Konrad had helped years ago with a matter no one needed to know about. Ever since, Dietmar had remained in that particular kind of debt, which is never demanded and never forgotten. Konrad did not ask for a favor. He offered him a discovery. There was a young editor, he said, an exceptionally talented one. The clinic documentary. Perhaps Dietmar remembered it. She was underemployed, which was a waste, and a man with Dietmar's eye would do well to secure her before someone else did. Was there not something available? A screening, a commission, one of those residencies that began with everyone spending a weekend together? As soon as possible, as attractive as possible. And it doesn't come from you, Dietmar said. He wasn't a stupid man. It comes from her work, Konrad replied. Her work speaks for itself. I'm only giving you the name because I happen to know it. Dietmar laughed the laugh of a man who had been offered a convenient opportunity to settle a debt. It would not be a problem, he said. In fact, the timing suited him well. They were already searching for someone for a project beginning in November, and an initial meeting could be arranged for that very weekend, somewhere just as beautiful and secluded as anything the sophisticated crowd might invent, except that they would speak about work there rather than about themselves. He would call her that very day. Konrad ended the call and allowed himself, for the duration of a single breath, the feeling of his own competence. It was a feeling he knew and distrusted, and he was right to distrust it. But that afternoon, alone in his office, he permitted himself to experience it for a moment. He imagined Mara receiving the call. A real man with a real offer, opening a real door for her. Given the choice between a weekend devoted to work and a weekend among strangers, she would choose the former because she was someone who took work more seriously than receptions. She would never learn what she had chosen against. It was the best thing a father like him could do for a daughter like her. Save her without her noticing, and never ask to be thanked. The feeling lasted for one day. Dietmar called back the following morning, and from the way he said hello, Konrad knew immediately that something was wrong. It was a strange business, Dietmar said. He had called the young woman. She had been warm, interested, intelligent on the telephone, exactly as Konrad had promised. They had spoken well, and she had wanted the opportunity. He had felt that clearly. Then, the next day, something had shifted. She already had plans, she had said. That exact weekend. Something she could not postpone. She was sorry. Perhaps another time. Polite, firm, final. These things happen, Konrad said, hearing how little conviction there was in his own voice. They happen, Dietmar agreed. But that is not all. When I try to make the offer more concrete, you know how it is. I need 2 or 3 commitments, some funding, a confirmed date. Everything began to crumble. Nothing dramatic. One backer suddenly wants to wait. A broadcaster can no longer keep the date. Someone who supported it yesterday is cautious today. Nothing but small things, none of which I could point to on its own. But together, Dietmar paused. Within that pause lay something Konrad had not wanted to hear. It is as though someone spoke to the same people before I did, as though the door was already closed before I knocked. Have you gotten yourself mixed up in something, Konrad? What has this woman become involved in? Nothing, Konrad said. Leave it alone. It was an idea. Forget the name. I already have, Dietmar replied. He sounded as though he meant it. That was the most disturbing part of the entire conversation. Konrad tried again by a second route, narrower than the first. He knew more about Mara's circumstances than she suspected, not because they were close, but because he had acquired the habit of knowing everything one could know about a person without asking them directly. He knew the approximate balance of her accounts because there were ways of learning such things. He knew that a permanent position, a secure one with regular pay, must have held more appeal for her than any secluded weekend. There was a broadcaster where, through 2 intermediaries, he could put in a word. A position had been advertised there for weeks, one for which Mara had, he knew, nearly applied. 1 telephone call, 1 recommendation that carried no trace of him. They would invite her soon and urgently with an appointment that conflicted with the weekend. He made the call. Several days later, he learned in passing that the position had unexpectedly been filled internally at short notice. They regretted it. No one was lying to him. Everything had proceeded entirely naturally, so naturally that there was nowhere one could place a finger and say, "Here." That very naturalness was the answer. The apparatus did not block the water. It allowed it to run downhill and merely ensured that the valley lay somewhere else. Konrad ended the call and remained seated. He had made a good move, a clean one that could not be traced back to him from the outside. The move had not been countered. It had been overtaken. Someone had been there before him, speaking to the same people, and standing at the same doors, with the calm inevitability of an apparatus that never hurried, because it had no need to. Mara had not declined because Dietmar's offer was inadequate. She had declined because she already had something planned for that weekend. Konrad knew what it was, and he knew that she still considered it good fortune. He attempted the rest in sequence because working through things in sequence was the final form his hope took. He reviewed the possibilities like items on a list and crossed each one out as soon as he had followed it to its conclusion. He could call her himself. A father calling his daughter was the most natural thing in the world. He even picked up the receiver and held it. In the second in which he might have dialed, he realized that he did not know her number by heart. He would have to look it up in a directory under H, as one looked up the number of a client. He imagined the conversation. Her voice would be cautious, immediately alert, because a call from him would be an irregularity, and she read irregularities as carefully as the apparatus did, except that she would suspect the wrong meaning behind them. He heard himself asking how she was. He heard the pause during which she considered what he truly wanted. When she was curt, she sounded like Vera, the same dry way of ending a sentence before it could become soft. For years, he had refused to notice it. This father had not called of his own accord in 20 years. A sudden call 3 days before that weekend would be a break in the pattern, and breaks in patterns were precisely what the apparatus read better than any human being. He replaced the receiver, crossed out. He could invent a pretext that forced her to remain. An illness, an emergency, a journey on which he needed her to accompany him. But any pretext powerful enough to prevent her from attending the weekend would also be powerful enough to frighten her. A frightened child asks for reasons. Reasons were the one thing he could never give her. Crossed out. He could warn her. Obliquely. Carefully. A single word whose meaning she might later piece together. But a warning vague enough not to betray him would be too vague to stop her. She would interpret it as the interference of a cold man who had never understood her. And out of defiance, she would travel there all the more quickly. A warning explicit enough to work would cease, in that same moment, to be a warning. It would become a confession. Crossed out. Every door he reached for had been locked by his own hand, years ago against people attempting exactly what he was attempting now. He had designed the system so that nothing from the outside could affect what happened within. That had been his achievement. That was why they had brought him in. Now he stood outside his own creation and could find no seam. It was only late that evening that the thought occurred to him which disposed of all the others. The telephone from which he had called Dietmar was not registered in his name. He had established it years before for precisely such conversations, a detour, clean and devised by Konrad himself. And Lindo had known about it at the club. He had mentioned it casually as though the detour had never been concealed. It was a route no one except Konrad knew about. No one could have known about, unless it had never been a detour at all, but merely another door whose key someone else had retained. Konrad had installed the telephone. He had never verified whether he was the only person who knew it existed. One does not inspect one's own precautions. One trusts them. That is their purpose. He understood now with the delayed comprehension of a man who had spent too long standing on the correct side of the lock, that there was no outside from which he could act. What he had taken for the outside was itself, part of the inside, built by him and entrusted to someone else without his ever realizing it. On the Thursday before the weekend, the thing that took away what remained came to him. It did not arrive as a blow. It arrived as a matter. Among the documents concerning the weekend, which passed over his desk because everything requiring discretion passed over his desk, lay the schedule of guests, journeys, and rooms. It was routine. He reviewed it as he reviewed everything, with the half-attention of a man checking spellings. There it was, arranged with the same indifferent order as everything else. A name, a time, an address. Holt, M. Collection, Friday, 12 p.m. He did not know the address from personal experience. He had never been there, but he knew the street and he knew that it was hers. He sat and read the line arranging the transportation of his daughter to the estate, where they would demand from her what they demanded from everyone. He did not need to sign anything. That was the point he only now understood completely. The line did not need him. It moved without him, through the same channels he had constructed and with the same calm efficiency. The apparatus required no participation from him, only his silence, and it already possessed that. He was not the instrument. He was the witness permitted to sit at the table so that he could see how well the machine he had built continued to operate. He returned the schedule to the other documents, neatly in its proper place. His hand was steady. He noticed that it was steady, and the fact that he needed to notice told him more about his condition than any trembling would have. The receptionist knocked and asked whether he wanted anything for lunch. He said no, as always, and she closed the door. For a moment he sat watching his hands as they lay flat upon the file, well kept, unoccupied, the hands of a man who had never done anything with them that others could see. He stood, walked to the small basin behind the door, and washed them thoroughly in the lukewarm water. It was the same procedure as every morning. It helped as little as it did every morning. There was nothing more he could do from the outside. Every lever the world offered had either been grasped by him or had already been pulled by a hand faster than his own. He did not allow the next thought to reach its conclusion because it led to a place from which there could be no return. The thought that if everything outside was locked, then perhaps something could still be done only where the machine itself operated. Inside it, in the place where, of all people, he knew most precisely how it had been assembled. He stopped just before the threshold, as he had trained himself to do. Stopping was a skill he had acquired over 30 years, so completely that it preceded him like the movements of his hands among the files. There were thoughts one was permitted to think, and there were thoughts which, once thought through to the end, made it impossible to continue living in the familiar form. The art lay in sensing the difference before one could name it, and withdrawing one's foot at precisely the right moment. He had needed that art in order to remain for 30 years, a man who merely administered the matters. Now he sensed that it would not carry him this time. The thought he refused to finish would finish itself inside him regardless, at night and without permission. And if he were honest, he was already standing on the other side of it without ever having noticed the threshold he had crossed. He had exhausted his maneuvers. What remained was no longer a maneuver. Chapter 6. The Acceptance. She called him because the happiness that had lingered inside her since the reception needed somewhere to grow larger, and because the short list of people who might serve that purpose ended in the same place where it had ended for 20 years. She called that same night. before she could talk herself out of it. She was prepared for the courteous pause in which he would weigh which response committed him to the least. She was prepared for the question who exactly, which she could already see approaching like a step in the dark. What she was not prepared for was his suggestion that they meet. "If you have time," he said, "before the weekend." "How do you know about the weekend?" Mara asked before she could stop herself. In the silence at the other end, she heard that the question had landed. "You just mentioned it," he said. She went back through the conversation in her mind and could not remember whether she had. She decided that she must have, because the alternative made no sense. They met the following day in a cafe he had chosen, one of those quiet, old-fashioned places where the tables stood far apart. Coffee arrived in pots, and the staff moved so softly that customers lowered their voices without realizing it. It was a place he understood, and she did not. Mara noticed that this was no accident, and resented him for it before he had spoken a word. On the way there, against her better judgment, she had imagined a different meeting. One in which he simply said, "That is wonderful. I am happy for you. Tell me everything." She knew him well enough to know it would not happen that way. Still, she had never managed to stop hoping it might. That hope, more persistent than every disappointment, was perhaps the only thing left of the child she had once been. She told herself to expect nothing. She told herself again during the final few steps before the cafe, the way one tells oneself not to tense an arm before an injection, and with the same result. He was already seated when she arrived, his back to the wall and the door within view. When he saw her, he stood. It was a brief, formal movement. For a moment before she arranged the expression she wore for him, Mara saw that he had grown older in a way that did not correspond to the few months since their last meeting. He looked tired. She registered it without interpreting it and sat down. "You look well," he said. "You are a poor liar." He actually smiled. It was brief but genuine, and it surprised her. It made things more difficult rather than easier, because a genuine smile was a door through which they might have passed, and experience had taught her that it would close again before either of them stepped through. They ordered. He asked about her work, and she realized that he had prepared. He knew the correct words: editing, documentary. He even mentioned the film about the clinic, which he could only have known about if he had made inquiries. For a moment, the knowledge that he had taken the trouble warmed her. Then she remembered that making inquiries was what he did professionally, and she no longer knew whether she was currently his daughter or a matter. "It is a good opportunity," she said when she told him about the weekend. She heard herself selling him something that had already been decided. She resented herself for it and could not stop. "They are serious people. They asked about my work. About me. Do you know how long it has been since that happened?" "Who asked?" There it was. She had seen it coming, and it struck her anyway because anticipating a blow does not soften it. It only makes it last longer. "Who?" she repeated. "That is your first question. Not what will you be doing, not what did they talk about. Who? It is a reasonable question. It is a lawyer's question. I am a lawyer. You are my father." The word lay between them on the table like something one of them ought to have picked up. Neither did. He turned the coffee cup slightly so that the handle pointed in another direction, a small gesture of arrangement. She did not know the movement, and yet she did. There was something familiar about it, a way of creating calm with his hands that she must have seen long ago when she still watched him closely. "I am happy for you," he said. It sounded as though the words cost him something. She assumed the effort lay in being happy for her. In truth, they cost him something else. "I only want you to." He stopped. She could see him weighing the words one by one, and that was what she hated most about him, the weighing, as though speaking were a risk against which one needed insurance. "There are circles," he said, "in which kindness is a tool, where someone invites you not because they value you, but because they intend something for you. The invitation is the first thing that appears genuine and is not." "You are describing every reception you have ever attended," Mara said. "You are describing your profession." "Yes." The answer came too quickly and too seriously. For a fraction of a second, something appeared in his face that did not belong to condescension, something she could not place and which, had she looked at it for longer, might have frightened her. She did not look longer. "Some doors," he said slowly, as though quoting something someone else had once told him, and which he was only now beginning to understand, "are held open for you because others have already closed elsewhere. You do not notice because the open one looks so welcoming. You walk through because it is open, and only once you are inside do you understand that it was the only door you had left." He looked at her. "I am not saying this to frighten you. I am saying it because I know those doors. I have stood beside some of them." "What does that mean, you have stood beside them?" "It means nothing." He retreated behind his usual smoothness so quickly that Mara wondered whether she had imagined the crack. "It means I am old and have seen too much, and I cannot help suspecting a trap in everything. An occupational defect. Do not listen to me." And because he himself told her not to listen, she readily obeyed. It confirmed what she already believed, that a tired, suspicious man sat before her, seeing the world through the clouded glass of his profession, and unable to bear the idea that something good might happen to his daughter without first passing through his hands. She did not know that in that exact moment she was both closer to him and farther away than she had ever been. He had told her the truth. She had heard it and translated it into its opposite. "Listen," she said. She made an effort to speak calmly because calmness gave her a superiority that raising her voice would have taken away. "I know you mean well. That is the strange thing. I genuinely believe that, in some way, you mean well. But you have no right. You cannot spend 20 years being an address I write to at Christmas, then appear the moment someone finally sees something in me and tell me to be careful. Careful of what? Someone wanting me? That has never happened before. Forgive me if I am willing to take the risk." He remained silent. She had expected him to object, to sharpen his tone, to give her the familiar coldness against which she could warm herself. Instead, he said nothing. The silence was worse because it looked like defeat and felt like something she could not name. He looked down at his hands. They rested calmly on the table, well kept, the narrow wedding band still on one finger, the ring he had never removed after her mother's death. Mara avoided looking at it because it was the only proof that there had once been a time when the three of them had been a single thing. They could have spoken about Vera. It was the only ground on which they had ever met without weapons. They both knew it and avoided it for the same reason. To step onto that ground would have required admitting how much they had lost. Not only her, but one another as well. Admissions like that had never found a form between them. Mara thought briefly of her mother and the way she had ended arguments simply by ceasing to participate in them. She wondered whether she had inherited that from Vera or from him. The possibility that she might have inherited something from him was unpleasant enough that she pushed the thought away. "When are you leaving?" he asked. "Friday. A car is collecting me." Something happened in his face when she said, "A car is collecting me." A slight movement around the eyes as though she had confirmed something he had hoped would be different. "You are not driving yourself. They are sending someone. That is just what they do. It is kind." "Yes," he said again. That same too quick, too serious yes. "That is what they do." "You do not even know them," Mara said. She meant it as an accusation. "You are judging people you have never met." Only after the words were out did she notice that he had not contradicted her. He had not rejected the possibility that he did know them. For the length of a breath, she remained caught on that fact. There was a way to explain all of it. His knowledge of the weekend. His too quick yes. The doors beside which he claimed to have stood. The way he did not deny knowing them. There was only one explanation, and at its beginning stood a thought that felt wrong to step onto, like a stair that was not there. She did not place her foot on it. It was too absurd to think at a cafe table on an ordinary Thursday, sitting opposite the tired, orderly man who was her father and who, as she had known since childhood, had no use for secrets except those belonging to his clients, which he administered like an accountant managing someone else's money. She let the thought fall as one lets fall a coin discovered to be worthless. The faint sound it made when it landed somewhere inside her and remained there went unheard. "Mara," he said. He rarely used her name. She saw that he wanted to say something larger than he would permit himself, and that, as always, he stopped just before reaching it. "If something there, if anything seems strange to you, anything, a door that will not open, a question that goes too far, you do not have to be polite. You are allowed to leave, at any time, even if leaving would be rude. Will you promise me that?" It was the most personal thing he had said to her in years. It came in the form of an instruction, a clause. "Will you promise me that?" For precisely that reason, it did not reach her as what it was. It reached her as what it appeared to be, one final attempt to retain control over something that did not concern him. Had he said it differently, she might have heard something. But he spoke as he spoke about everything, guarded and conditional, and she responded to the tone rather than the meaning. "I am an adult," she said. "I can take care of myself. I've been doing it for 20 years. He nodded slowly, like a man receiving a judgment against which no appeal was possible. With a small gesture the staff understood immediately. He asked for the bill and paid before she could reach for her bag. She resented that as well because it deprived her of the final word that paying would have given her. Outside the cafe in the cold air, they stood together for a moment too long because neither knew how such a meeting was supposed to end. He made no attempt to embrace her. She was grateful and disappointed in proportions she could not have calculated. "Contact me," he said, "when you are back." Sure. She did not mean it. They both knew she did not mean it, and it was one of the few truths that had passed effortlessly between them during the past 20 years. She walked away first because she could not bear to watch him leave. After a few steps at the corner, she turned despite having resolved not to. He still stood where she had left him outside the cafe, his hands in the pockets of his coat, watching her without moving. The expression on his face was impossible to read. From that distance, had she been closer, she might have refused to read it anyway. She raised one hand briefly, a restrained wave that was more acknowledgement than farewell. He did not raise his. She pushed the meeting away before she even reached the train, just as she had pushed away the old man's question after the reception. She had become good at pushing things away. It was a skill one acquired when one had been forced to manage alone. When she sat inside the train and watched the city pass, what remained wasn't his warning, which she would later barely remember, but the sentence she herself had spoken. I have been doing it for 20 years. The more often she turned it over, the more solid it felt. It was true. It was her pride. And without realizing it, it was the very argument with which she pushed away the last hand reaching for her. A car would come on Friday. She had accepted long before she had accepted, and nothing that happened on Thursday had altered that. Except that now, perhaps, she would travel with slightly greater determination, in defiance of the father who had arrived too late to be one.